In the realm of philosophy, the topic of death is no rare occurrence, having been given innumerous treatments throughout time by such luminaries as Socrates, Schopenhauer, Cioran, and Epicurus, to name a few. We will here explore the latter philosopher, namely Epicurus, and his views on the subject matter, which can be seen as a major component in Epicurean philosophy. Epicurus teaches us that there is a misalignment when dealing with death, as one places emphasis on death itself, that according to Epicurus is merely an act which cancels existence, and it is therefore the process of dying which is problematic to the many and causes unnecessary pain, but can be dealt with through rationalist means. To quote Epicurus from a letter to his friend Emmanouill, a work which gives us a summary of Epicurean ethics, we have the following passage. If a man is perhaps to be wretched and in pain in the future, he must of course be existent at that time, if evil is to befall him. Now, since death does away with life and cancels the existence of everyone to whom such afflictions might accrue, we may infer that there is nothing in death for us to fear, and that we cannot be wretched if we are non-existent. Death, then, according to Epicurus, meant the nullification of existence, and as we are not present consciously in non-existence to be grieved about death, then it is meaningless to worry about death at all. Note here that one possible interpretation of this may be as an epistemological claim, or rather lack of, as we cannot sense or have access to non-existence, and it is therefore nonsensical to talk about how death can be harmful in its effect. Much like we cannot contemplate our sense of being before we were born, the fear of death becomes a useless action, as there does not exist any thoughts of death in non-existence, meaning our lack of access makes this fear ineffable. Alternatively, if we play along with death's existence as something real to be dealt with, then as death puts an end to both sensation as well as meaning, it follows that death itself loses importance. That is, while we are living, our death is not immediately following, and when we die, we cease to exist, thereby negating our insistence on the fear of death. In both cases, it is possible to use our rational senses and capacities to eliminate our fear of death, according to Epicurus, which was something that he and his followers espoused. This elimination of death's fearful grip would then allow for the greater cultivation of happiness in the present state, where, much like the ancient Greeks, the Epicureans were interested in exploring the question of what makes a happy life. For Epicurus, the cultivation of happiness was the goal in life, and emphasis was to be placed on pleasure as a moral good, either physical or mental. One may, in fact, view his concept of pleasure more aptly as an absence of pain, or in Greek, aponia, where correspondingly the counterpart of pain was seen as a moral evil. Pain here is taken to mean both as a physical component as well as a mental disturbance. As fear of death consumes the waking life of humans through anxiety and leads to unwanted behavior such as selfishness, one would, according to Epicurus, view this fear as a pain in itself to be ridden of. After subsequently eliminating this fear, one has in effect gone through a form of mental therapy, where one's new existence will be more suited for plain living and contemplation, in the company of friendship or philia, which Epicurus placed in very high regard. Indeed, his prescription for the remedy of the fear of death may be seen in a larger context of his views on philosophy, in which he regarded the foremost task of philosophy to act as a form of therapy for life, acting on the individual. Likewise, one should, according to Epicurus, not fear that of not living as a prolonged existence, although he himself lived to the ripe age of 71, as life should be worshipped as the most savory meal instead of the incessant focus of attaining larger portions throughout life. Note here the plurality of fears that Epicurus talks about in relation with death, which may function as a stronghold in his philosophy against the claim that one possesses a fear of death for other reasons. In other words, the fear of death could come in several varieties according to Epicurus. It's also important to note that Epicurus himself was a materialist and did not believe in an afterlife, and as such, life ceases to exist after death, furthermore placing emphasis on the lack of concern for death. He also articulated a view that the soul itself is both fragile and mortal, which was more eloquently elaborated upon by fellow Epicurean Lucretius, who argued that the body and soul form a single material unit. While Epicurus wrote on naturalism, it is his writing on ethics that has gained the most popularity following his death. It should also be mentioned that only a handful of his writings have survived, although it is reported that he wrote copious amounts of works in his day, as attested by historical record. As another possible counter to Epicurus and his philosophy regarding death, we might argue the evolutionary advantages that a developed sense of fear has provided human beings throughout time. The argument here being that humans with a strong predilection for having a keen sense of fear in the presence of danger and wanting to avoid death would live to pass on their genetic material more often than an opposite sort of being. However, a retort to this argument, one could argue, which has been done in a paper I will link below in the description, that there exists a variety of fear of death in Epicurean philosophy, which arises from ineliminable desires and therefore cannot be possible to combat through rationality, thus leaving room for a healthy dose of fear, so to speak. It is certainly true that Epicurus was not an opponent of all fears, but there is still room for debate around what is implied by Epicurus regarding his philosophy of the fear of death. Lastly, it is not empirically verified that maximizing desires will lead to a happier life. In fact, it may be difficult to even talk about how one would empirically verify such moral facts. We could borrow a phrase from the philosopher J.L. Mackie and relate such objective moral values belonging to a category of moral queerness, for were they to exist, these moral facts would be very different from anything we could imagine, and it is difficult to ascertain how we could even come to know about them through empirical means. Now, relating the story back to the man himself, Epicurus, he would face death after a prolonged illness of urinary complications, reinforcing his own belief of providing tolerance to both disease and pain to the very end. He would provide details on his own symptoms, including abdominal pain and painful urination, which was painfully aware would lead to his ultimate demise. In other words, death was close. Yet, for Epicurus, intense pain was momentary, stating, "The greatest pains could not last for long. Either they go away together with life, or their magnitude decreases." Thus, being steadfast to his own philosophy, in neither rejecting life through suicide, while at the same time neither fearing for living nor the upcoming death, he simply ceased to exist.